Nizza Macaskri, for it is useless to affect further mystery, as soon as she could find utterance, murmured her thanks to the apprentice, whose satisfaction at her deliverance was greatly diminished by his fears lest his master should disapprove of what he had done. Seeing his uneasiness, and guessing the cause, Nizza hastened to relieve it. "I reproach myself bitterly for having placed you in this situation," she said, "but I could not help it, and will free you from my presence the moment I can do so with safety. When I bade you farewell, I meant it to be forever, and persuaded myself I could adhere to my resolution. But I was deceived. You would pity me, were I to tell you the anguish I endured. I could not accompany my poor father in his rambles, and if I went forth at all, my steps involuntarily led me to Wood Street. At last, I resolved to disguise myself, and borrowed this suit from a Jew clothesman, who has a stall in St. Paul's. Thus equipped, I paced backwards and forwards before the house, in the hope of obtaining a glimpse of you, and fortune has favored me more than I expected, though it has led to this unhappy result. Heaven only knows what will become of me," she added, bursting into tears. "Oh, that the pestilence would select me as one of its victims! But, like your own sex, it shuns all those who court it." "I can neither advise you," replied Leonard, in somber tone, "nor help you." "Ah," he exclaimed, as the sounds of violent blows were heard against the door below, "your persecutors are trying to break into the house." Rushing to the window, and gazing downwards, he perceived Sir Paul Paravison and Pillicati battering against the shop door, and endeavouring to burst it open. It was, however, so stoutly barricaded, that it resisted all their efforts. "What is to be done?" cried Leonard. "The noise will certainly alarm my master, and you will be discovered." "Heed me not," rejoined Nizza, distractedly, "you shall not run any risk on my account. Let me down the pulley. Deliver me to them. Anything is better than that you should suffer by my indiscretion." "No, no," replied Leonard, "Mr. Blondel shall know all. His love for his own daughter will make him feel for you. But come what will, I will not abandon you." As he spoke, a timid knock was heard at the door, and a voice without exclaimed, in accents of the utmost trepidation, "Are you there, Leonard? Robbers are breaking into the house. We shall all be murdered." "Come in, Blaise," returned Leonard, opening the door and admitting the porter. "You may be of some assistance to me." "In what way?" demanded Blaise. "Ah! Who's this?" he added, perceiving Nizza. "What is this page doing here?" "Do not concern yourself about him but attend to me," replied Leonard. "I am about to drive away those persons from the door. You must lower me down in the basket attached to the pulley." "And will you dare to engage them?" asked Blaise, peeping out at the shutter. "They are armed. As I live, one is Major Pillicati, the rascal who dared to make love to Patience. I have half a mind to go down with you, and give him a sound drubbing." "You shall not encounter this danger for me," interposed Nizza, endeavouring to stay Leonard, who, having thrust a sword into his girdle, was about to pass through the window. "Do not hinder me," replied the apprentice, breaking from her. "Take hold of the rope, Blaise, and mind it does not run down too quickly." With this, he got into the basket, and as the porter carefully obeyed his instructions, he reached the ground in safety. On seeing him, Pillicati bolted across the street, and flourishing his sword, and uttering tremendous imprecations, held himself in readiness to beat an immediate retreat. Not so Paravison. Instantly assailing the apprentice, he slightly wounded him in the arm. Seeing how matters stood, and that victory was pretty certain to declare itself for his patron, Pillicati returned, and, attacking the apprentice, by their combined efforts, he was speedily disarmed. Pillicati would have passed his sword through his body, but the knight stayed his hand. "The fool has placed himself in our power," he said, and he shall pay for his temerity. Nevertheless, I will spare his life provided he assist us to get into the house, or will deliver up Nizamacaskri." "I will do neither," replied Leonard, fiercely. Paravicin raised his sword, and was about to strike, when, at the moment, the basket was again quickly lowered to the ground. It bore Nizamacaskri, who, rushing between them, arrested the stroke. "Oh! Why have you done this?" cried Leonard, in a tone of reproach. "I will tell you why," rejoined Paravicin, triumphantly, "because she saw you were unable to defend her, and, like a true woman, surrendered herself to the victor. Take care of him, Pilicati, while I secure the girl. Spit him, if he attempts to stir." And twining his arms round Niza, notwithstanding her shrieks and resistance, he bore her away. Infuriated by the sight, Leonard Holt threw himself upon Pilicati, and a desperate struggle took place between them, which terminated this time successfully for the apprentice. Wresting his long rapier from the bully, Leonard rushed after Paravicin, and reached the end of Wood Street, just in time to see him spring into a coach, and drive off with his prize. Speeding after them along Blowbladder Street, and Middle Row, as Newgate Street was then termed, the apprentice shouted to the coachman to stop, but no attention being paid to his vociferations, and finding pursuit unavailing, he came to a halt. He then more slowly retraced his steps, and on arriving at the grocer's residence, found the basket drawn up. Almost afraid to call out, he at length mustered courage enough to shout to Blaze to lower it, and was answered by Mr. Bloundel, who, putting his head through the window, demanded in a stern tone why he had left the house. Leonard briefly explained. "I deeply regret your imprudence," replied his master, "because I can now no more admit you. It is my fixed determination, as you well know, not to suffer any member of my family who may quit my house, to enter it again." "I shall not attempt to remonstrate with you, sir," replied Leonard. "All I pray of you is to allow me to occupy this hutch, and to act as your porter." "Willingly," rejoined Mr. Bloundel, "and as you have had the plague, you will run no risk of infection. You shall know all that passes within doors, and I only lament that you should have banished yourself from the asylum which I hoped to afford you." After some further conversation between them, a bundle was lowered by the grocer, containing a change of clothes and a couple of blankets. On receiving these, Leonard retired to the hutch, and tying a handkerchief round his wounded arm, wrapped himself in a night trail, and stretching himself on the ground, in spite of his anxiety, soon sank asleep. He awoke about 4 o'clock in the morning, with a painful consciousness of what had taken place during the night. It was just beginning to grow light, and he walked across the street to gaze at the house from which he was exiled. Its melancholy, uninhabited look did not serve to cheer him. It seemed totally altered since he knew it first. The sign, which then invited the passers-by to enter the shop and deal with its honest owner, now appeared no longer significant, unless, and it will be remembered it was the Noah's Ark, it could be supposed to have reference to those shut up within. The apprentice looked at the habitation with misgiving, and, instead of regarding it as a sanctuary from the pestilence, could not help picturing it as a living tomb. The last conversation he had had with Amabel also arose forcibly to his recollection, and the little likelihood there appeared of seeing her again gave him acute agony. Oppressed by this painful idea, and unable to exclude from his thoughts the unhappy situation of Nizamacaskri, he bent his steps, scarcely knowing whither he was going, towards St. Paul's. Having passed so much of his time of late in the cathedral, Leonard began to regard it as a sort of home, and it now appeared like a place of refuge to him. Proceeding to the great western entrance, he seated himself on one of the large blocks of stone left there by the masons occupied in repairing the exterior of the fane. His eye rested upon the mighty edifice before him, and the clear sparkling light revealed numberless points of architectural grandeur and beauty which he had never before noticed. The enormous buttresses and lofty pinnacles of the central tower were tinged with the beams of the rising sun, and glowed as if built of porphyry. While gazing at the summit of this tower, and calling to mind the magnificent view he had recently witnessed from it at the same hour, if a wish could have transported him thither at that moment, he would have enjoyed it again. But as this could not be, he tried to summon before his mental vision the whole glorious prospect, the broad and shining river, with its moving or motionless craft, the gardens, the noble mansions, the warehouses, and mighty wharfs on its banks, London Bridge, with its enormous pile of habitations, the old and picturesque city, with its innumerable towers and spires, and girdle of grey walls, the green fields and winding lanes leading to the lovely hills around it. All these objects arose obedient to his fancy, and came arrayed in colouring as fresh as that wherein they had before appeared to him. While thus occupied, his gaze remained riveted on the summit of the central tower, and he fancied he perceived some one leaning over the balustrade, but as little beyond the upper part of the figure could be discerned, and as it appeared perfectly motionless, he could not be quite sure that his eyes did not deceive him. Having gazed at the object for some minutes, during which it maintained the same attitude, he continued his survey of the pile, and became so excited by the sublime emotions inspired by the contemplation, as to be insensible to aught else. After a while he arose, and was about to proceed towards the portico, when, chancing to look at the top of the tower, he remarked that the figure had disappeared, and while wondering who it could be, he perceived a person emerge from one of the tall windows in the lower part of the tower. It was Solomon Eagle, and he no longer wondered at what he had seen. The enthusiast was without his brazier, but carried a long stout staff. He ran along the pointed roof of the nave with inconceivable swiftness, till, reaching the vast stone cross, upwards of 12 feet in height, ornamenting the western extremity, he climbed its base, and clasping the transverse bar of the sacred symbol of his faith with his left arm, extended his staff with his right, and described a circle, as if pointing out the walls of the city. He then raised his staff towards heaven to invoke its vengeance, and anon pointed it menacingly downwards. After this he broke into loud denunciations, but though the apprentice could not hear the words, he gathered their purport from his gestures. By this time a few masons had assembled, and producing their implements, commenced working at the blocks of stone. Glancing at the enthusiast, one of them observed with a smile to his companion, "There is Solomon Eagle pronouncing his morning curse upon the city. I wonder whether the judgments he utters against it will come to pass." "Assuredly, Phil Gatford," replied the other mason, gravely, "and I look upon all the work we are now doing as labor thrown away. Was he not right about the plague? Did he not foretell the devouring scourge by which we are visited? And he will be right also about the fire. Since he has doomed it, this cathedral will be consumed by flames, and one stone will not be left standing on another." "It is strange, Ned Turgis," observed Gatford, "that, though Solomon Eagle may always be seen at daybreak at the top of the tower or on the roof of the cathedral, sometimes at one point and sometimes at another, no one can tell where he hides himself at other times. He no longer roams the streets at night, but you may remember when the officers of justice were in search of him, to give evidence against Mother Malmains and Chales, he was not to be found." "I remember it," replied Turgis, "but I have no doubt he was hidden in some out-of-the-way corner of the cathedral, perhaps among the immense wooden beams of the clerestory, or in some of the secret passages or cells contrived in the thickness of the walls," rejoined the first speaker. "I say, Ned Turgis, if the plague increases, as there is every likelihood it will, Solomon Eagle will be the only preacher left in St. Paul's. Neither deans, prebends, minor canons, nor vicars will attend. As it is, they have almost abandoned it." "Shame on them," exclaimed Leonard Holt, who, being much interested in the conversation of the masons, had silently approached them. "At this season, more than ever, they are bound to attend to their duty." "Why, so I think," rejoined Gatford, "but I suppose they consider self-preservation their first duty. They aver that all assemblages, whether called together for religious purposes or not, are dangerous, and likely to extend the pestilence." "And yet crowds are permitted to assemble for purposes of amusement, if not for worship, in those holy walls," returned Leonard. "Not so," replied Gatford. "Very few persons now come there, and none for amusement. Paul's Walk is completely deserted. The shops and stalls have been removed, and the pillars to which they were attached are restored to their former appearance." "I am glad to hear it," rejoined Leonard. "I would far rather the sacred edifice were altogether abandoned than be what it has been of late, a den of thieves." "It was a stable and a magazine of arms in the time of the Commonwealth," remarked Gatford. "And if Solomon Eagle's foreboding come to pass, it will be a heap of ruins in our own time," rejoined Turgis. "But I see the prophet of ill has quitted his post, and retired to his hiding place." Looking up as this was said, Leonard saw that the enthusiast had disappeared. At this moment the great door of the cathedral was thrown open, and, quitting the masons, he ascended the broad steps under the portico, and entered the fane, where he found that the information he had received was correct, and that the stalls and other disfigurements to the pillars had been removed. After pacing the solitary aisles for some time, he made inquiries from the verger concerning Solomon Eagle. "I know nothing about him," replied the man, reluctantly. "I believe he always appears at daybreak on some part of the roof, but I am as ignorant as yourself where he hides himself. The door of the winding staircase leading to the central tower is open. You can ascend it, and search for him, if you think proper." Acting upon the suggestion, Leonard mounted to the belfry, and from thence to the summit of the tower. Having indulged himself with a brief survey of the glorious view around, he descended, and glanced into every cell and chamber as he passed, in the hopes of meeting with the enthusiast, but he was disappointed. At length, as he got about halfway down, he felt his arm forcibly grasped, and, instantly conjecturing who it was, offered no resistance. Without uttering a word, the person who had seized him dragged him up a few steps, pushed aside a secret door, which closed behind them with a hollow clangor, and leading him along a dark narrow passage, opened another door, and they emerged upon the roof. He then found that his suspicion was correct, and that his mysterious guide was no other than Solomon Eagle. "I am glad to find you have recovered from the pestilence," said the enthusiast, regarding him with a friendly glance. "It proves you are favored by heaven. I saw you in the open space before the cathedral this morning, and instantly recognized you. I was in the belfry when you descended, but you did not perceive me, and I wished to be certain you were alone before I discovered myself." "You have ceased to roam the streets at night, and roused the slumbering citizens to repentance?" asked Leonard. "For the present I have," returned Solomon Eagle. "But I shall appear again when I am required. But you shall now learn why I have brought you hither. Look along those streets," he added, pointing to the thoroughfares opening in different directions. "What see you?" "I see men piling heaps of wood and coals at certain distances, as if they were preparing bonfires," replied Leonard. "And yet it cannot be. This is no season for rejoicing." "It has been supposed that the lighting of many thousand fires at once will purify the air," replied Solomon Eagle, "and therefore the Lord Mayor has given orders that heaps of fuel shall be placed before every house in every street in the city, and that all these heaps shall be kindled at a certain hour. But it will be of no avail. The weather is now fine and settled, and the sky cloudless. But the offended deity will cause the heaviest rain to descend, and extinguish their fires. No, the way to avert the pestilence is not by fire, but by prayer and penitence, by humiliation and fasting. Let this sinful people put on sackcloth and ashes. Let them beseech God, by constant prayer, to forgive them, and they may prevail, but not otherwise." "And when are these fires to be lighted?" asked the apprentice. "Tonight, at midnight," replied Solomon Eagle. He then took Leonard by the hand, and led him back the same way he had brought him. On reaching the spiral staircase, he said, "If you desire to behold a sight, such as a man has seldom witnessed, ascend to the summit of this tower an hour after midnight, when all these fires are lighted. A small door on the left of the northern entrance shall be left open. It will conduct you to the back of the choir, and you must then find your way hither as well as you can." Murmuring his thanks, Leonard hurried down the spiral staircase, and quitting the cathedral, proceeded in the direction of Wood Street. Preparations were everywhere making for carrying the Lord Mayor's orders into effect, and such was the beneficial result anticipated, that a general liveliness prevailed. On reaching his master's residence, he found him at the shutter, curious to know what was going forward, and having informed him, the grocer immediately threw him down money to procure wood and coal. "I have but little faith in the experiment," he said, "but the Lord Mayor's injunctions must be obeyed." With the help of Dallison, who had now arrived, Leonard Holt soon procured a large heap of fuel, and placed it in the middle of the street. The day was passed in executing other commissions for the grocer, and he took his meals in the hutch with the porter. Time appeared to pass with unusual slowness, and not he alone, but anxious thousands, awaited the signal to kindle their fires. The night was profoundly dark and sultry, and Leonard could not help thinking that the enthusiast's prediction would be verified, and that rain would fall. But these gloomy anticipations vanished as the hour of midnight was told forth by the neighboring clocks of St. Michael's and St. Albans. Scarcely had the strokes died away, when Leonard seized a light and set fire to the pile. 10,000 other piles were kindled at the same moment, and in an instant the pitchy darkness was converted into light as bright as that of noonday. Anxious to behold this prodigious illumination at its best, Leonard Holt committed the replenishing of the pile and the custody of the house to Dallison, and hastened to St. Paul's. A great fire was burning at each angle of the cathedral, but without pausing to notice the effect of the flames upon the walls of the building, he passed through the door to which he had been directed, and hastening to the spiral staircase beyond the choir, ascended it with swift steps. He did not pause till he reached the summit of the tower, and there, indeed, a wondrous spectacle awaited him. The whole city seemed on fire, and girded with a flaming belt, for piles were lighted at certain distances along the whole line of walls. The groups of dark figures collected round the fires added to their picturesque effect, and the course of every street could be traced by the reflection of the flames on the walls and gables of the houses. London Bridge was discernible from the fires burning upon it, and even upon the river braziers were lighted on all the larger craft, which cast a ruddy glow upon the stream. After gazing at this extraordinary sight for some time, Leonard began to descend. As yet he had seen nothing of Solomon Eagle, and searching for him in vain in the belfry, he quitted the cathedral. From a knot of persons gathered round one of the fires he learnt that the enthusiast was addressing the crowd at the west side of the building, and proceeding thither he perceived him standing on the edge of the balustrade of the southwestern tower, surmounting the little church of St. Gregory. His brazier was placed on one of the buttresses, and threw its light on the mighty central tower of the fabric, and on a large clock face immediately beneath. Solomon Eagle was evidently denouncing the city, but his words were lost in the distance. As he proceeded, a loud clap of thunder pealed overhead. It comes," cried the enthusiast, in a voice that could be distinctly heard in the deathlike stillness that followed the thunder. "The wrath of heaven is at hand." As he spoke, a bright flash cut the air, and a bolt struck down one of the pinnacles of the great tower. Flash after flash followed in quick succession, and the enthusiast, who seemed wrapped in flame, extended his arms towards heaven, as if beseeching a further display of its vengeance. Suddenly the lightning ceased to flash and the thunder to roll. A few heavy drops of rain fell. These were succeeded by a deluging shower of such violence, that in less than a quarter of an hour every fire within the city was extinguished, and all was darkness and despair. The deepest gloom and despondency prevailed that night throughout London. The sudden storm was regarded as a manifestation of the displeasure of heaven, and as an intimation that the arrows of its wrath were not to be turned aside by any human efforts. So impressed were all with this feeling, that when, in less than half an hour, the rain entirely ceased, the clouds cleared off, and the stars again poured down their luster, no one attempted to relight the quenched embers, fearing to provoke the divine vengeance. Nor was a monitor wanting to enforce the awful lesson. Solomon Eagle, with his brazier on his head, ran through the streets, calling on the inhabitants to take to heart what had happened, to repent, and prepare for their doom. "The Lord will not spare you," he cried, as he stationed himself in the open space before St. Stephen's, Walbrook. "He will visit your sins upon you. Pray, therefore, that ye may not be destroyed, both body and soul. Little time is allowed you for repentance. Many that hear me shall not live till tomorrow, few shall survive the year. Thou, thyself, shalt not survive the night, false prophet," cried a voice from a neighboring window. And immediately afterwards the barrel of a gun was thrust forth and a shot fired at the enthusiast. But though Solomon Eagle never altered his position, he was wholly uninjured, the ball striking a bystander, who fell to the ground mortally wounded. "You have shot your own son, Mr. Westwood," cried one of the spectators, rushing up to the fallen man. "Who will henceforth doubt that Solomon Eagle is under the care of a special providence?" "Not I," replied another spectator. "I shall never disregard his words in future." Setting down his brazier, the enthusiast bent over the dead man, for dead he was, and noted the placid smile upon his features. By this time the unfortunate father had joined the group, and, on seeing the body of his son, wrung his hands in a pitiable manner, and gave utterance to the wildest expression of despair. No one attempted to seize him, till at length Solomon Eagle, rising from his kneeling posture, laid his hand upon his arm, and regarding him sternly, said, "What wrong have I done you, that you should seek to slay me?" "What wrong?" rejoined Westwood, "such wrong as can never be repaired. Your fearful prophecies and denunciations so terrified my daughter, that she died distracted. My broken-hearted wife was not long in following her, and now you have made me the murderer of my son. Complete the tragedy, and take my life." "I have no desire to do so," replied Solomon Eagle, in a tone of commiseration. "My wish is to save your soul, and the souls of all who listen to me. I wonder not that your anger was at first stirred against me, but if your heart had been properly directed, indignation would have soon given way to better feelings. My mission is not to terrify, but to warn. Why will ye thus continue impenitent when ye are spoken to, not by my voice alone, but by 1,000 others, by the thunder, by the rain, by the pestilence, and ye shall be spoken to, if he continue senseless, by fire and by famine. Look at these quenched embers, at these flooded streets, they are types of your vain struggle with a superior power. Now, mark me what you must do to free the city from contagion. You must utterly and forever abandon your evil courses. You must pray incessantly for remission of your sins. You must resign yourselves without repining to such chastisement as you have provoked, and must put your whole trust and confidence in God. Do this, and do it heartily. It is possible that his wrath may be averted." "I feel the force of your words," faltered Westwood. "Would I had felt it sooner." "Repentance never comes too late," rejoined the enthusiast. "Let this be an example to you all." And snatching up his brazier, he continued his course at the same lightning speed as before. The unfortunate father was taken into his own dwelling, whither likewise the body of his son was conveyed. A strict watch was kept over him during the night, and in the morning he was removed to Newgate, where he perished, in less than a week, of the distemper. The aspect of the streets on the following day was deplorable enough. Not that the weather was unfavorable. On the contrary, it was bright and sunny, while the heated atmosphere, cooled by the showers, felt no longer oppressive. But the sight of the half-burned fires struck a chill into every bosom, and it was not until the heaps were removed that the more timorous ventured forth at all. The result, too, of the experiment was singularly unfortunate. Whether it was from the extraordinary heat occasioned by the lighting of so many fires, or that the smoke did not ascend, and so kept down the pestilential effluvia, or that the number of persons who met together spread the contagion, certain it was that the pestilence was more widely extended than before, and the mortality fearfully increased. On the commencement of the storm, Leonard Holt hurried back to Wood Street, and reached his master's dwelling just as the rain began to descend in torrents. Mr. Bloundell was at the window, and a few words only passed between him and the apprentice when the latter was compelled to take refuge in the hutch. Here he found Dallas and the watchman, and they listened in awestruck silence to the heavy showers, and to the hissing of the blazing embers in their struggle against the hostile element. By and by the latter sounds ceased. Not a light could be seen throughout the whole length of the street, nor was there any red reflection of the innumerable fires as heretofore in the sky. It was evident all were extinguished, and the pitiless pelting of the rain, the roar of the waterspouts, and the rush of the overfilled kennels, now converted into rivulets, could alone be heard. After a while the storm cleared off, and Leonard and his companion issued from their retreat, and gazed in silence at the drenched heap before them. While thus occupied, the window above them opened, and the grocer appeared at it. "This is, indeed, a sad and striking lesson," he said, "and I hope will not be lost upon those who have witnessed it. It shows the utter impotency of a struggle against the divine will, and that when a man relies upon himself for preservation, he depends upon a broken reed. If I did not place myself under heaven's protection, I should be sure that all my own precautions were unavailing. I am now about to call up my family to prayer. You can join us in our supplications, and I trust they will not be unheard." Closing the window, the grocer retired, and Leonard returned to the hutch, where he fell upon his knees, and as soon as he supposed the family were gathered together, commenced his own prayers. He pictured the whole group assembled, the fervor of the grocer excited to an unwonted pitch by what had just occurred, the earnest countenances of his wife and the younger children, and the exalted looks of Amabel. He could not see her, neither could he hear her voice, but he fancied how she looked, and in what terms she prayed, and it was no slight satisfaction to him to think that his own voice ascended to heaven coupled with hers. On quitting the hutch, he found Dallison conversing with Dr. Hodges. The physician expressed great surprise at seeing him, and inquired how he came to have left his master's house. Leonard related all that had happened, and besought his assistance in Niz's behalf. "I will do all I can for her," replied Hodges, "for I feel greatly interested about her. But who is this Sir Paul Paravicin? I never heard of him." "I know nothing more of him than what I have told you, sir," replied Leonard. "He is a friend of the Earl of Rochester." "It must be a feigned name," rejoined Hodges, "but I will speedily find him out. You must lodge at my house tonight. It will be better for you than sleeping in that damp shed. But, first, I must have a word or two with your master. I have been abroad all night, and came hither to ascertain what he thought of this plan of the fires, and what he had done. How do you give the signal to him?" "There is a cord within the hutch by which you can sound a bell within his chamber," returned Leonard. "I will ring it." Accordingly, he did so, and the summons was almost instantly answered by the grocer. A kindly greeting passed between the latter and Hodges, who inquired whether all was going on satisfactorily within, and whether anything could be done for the family. "I would not have disturbed you at this unseasonable hour," he said, "but chancing to be in your neighborhood, and thinking it likely you would be on the watch, I called to have a word with you. Though I could not foresee what would happen, I entirely disapproved of these fires as likely to increase rather than check the pestilence. The hand of heaven has extinguished them because they were lighted in opposition to its decrees," replied Blondel, "but you have asked me whether all is going on well within. I should answer readily in the affirmative, but that my wife expresses much anxiety respecting Amabel. We have no longer any apprehension of misconduct. She is all we could desire, serious and devout. But we have fears for her health. The confinement may be too much for her. What would you recommend?" "I must see her to be able to speak confidently," replied Hodges. "I know not how that can be accomplished, unless you choose to ascend by a basket attached to the pulley," replied the grocer, with some hesitation, "and it is against my plan to admit you." "But your daughter's life, my good friend," rejoined Hodges, "think of that. If I choose to risk life and limb to visit her, you may surely risk the chance of contagion to admit me. But you need have no fear. Sprinkle your room with spirits of sulfur, and place a phial of vinegar so that I can use it on my first entrance into the house, and I will answer for the safety of your family." These preparations made, Mr. Blondel lowered the basket, into which Hodges got, and grasping the rope, not without some misgiving on his part, he was drawn up. Leonard witnessed his ascent with a beating heart, and could scarcely repress a feeling of envy when he saw him pass through the window, and knew that he would soon be in the presence of Amabel. But this feeling quickly changed into one of deep anxiety concerning her. Her father's account of her had increased the uneasiness he previously felt, and he was as anxious to know the doctor's opinion of her, as if his own fate had depended upon it. He was kept in this painful state of suspense for nearly an hour, when voices were heard at the window, and presently afterwards Hodges was carefully let down. Bidding the grocer farewell, he desired Leonard to follow him, and led the way towards Cheapside. They proceeded a short distance in silence, when the latter ventured to remark, "You say nothing about Amabel, sir? I fear you found her seriously indisposed." "Do not question me about her just now," rejoined the doctor, in a subdued emotion. "I would rather not discuss the subject." Nothing more was said, for though the apprentice would willingly have continued the conversation, his companion's evident disinclination to pursue it compelled him to desist. In this way, they reached the doctor's residence, where Leonard was immediately shown to a comfortable bed. It was late when he awoke next day, and as the doctor was gone forth, he partook of a plentiful breakfast which was placed before him, and repaired to Wood Street, but his master having no commissions for him to execute, he went back again. By this time, Dr. Hodges had returned, and calling him into his library told him he wished to speak with him. "You were right last night," he said, "in construing my silence into alarm for Amabel. In truth, I fear she is rapidly sinking into a decline, and nothing will arrest the progress of the insidious disease but instant removal to the country. To this she will not consent, neither do I know how it could be accomplished. It is pitiable to see so lovely a creature dying, as I fear she is, of a broken heart." Leonard covered his face with his hands, and wept aloud. "We have not yet spoken of Nisa Macaskry," said Hodges, after a pause, tapping him kindly on the shoulder. "I think I have discovered a trace of her." "I am glad to hear it," replied Leonard, rousing himself. "She is another victim of these profligates. But I will be revenged upon them all." "I have before enjoined you to restrain your indignation, just though it be," returned Hodges. "I have not yet found out whither she has been taken. But I have a clue which, unless I am mistaken, will lead me to it. But I must now dismiss you. I have other affairs to attend to, and must give a dangerous and difficult case, on which I have been consulted, undisturbed consideration. Make my house your home as long as you think proper." Warmly thanking the doctor, Leonard then withdrew. Shortly after this, he walked forth, and ascertaining that he was not required by his master, determined to satisfy himself by actual observation of the extent of the ravages of the plague. With this view, he shaped his course along Lad Lane, and traversing Catteaton Street, entered Lothbury. The number of houses which he here found closed, with red crosses on the doors, and the fatal inscription above them, convinced him that the deplorable accounts he had heard were not exaggerated. In passing some of these habitations, he saw such ghastly faces at the windows, and heard such lamentable cries, that he was glad to hurry on and get out of sight and hearing. In Throgmorton Street, nearly opposite Draper's Hall, a poor wretch suddenly opened a casement, and before his attendants could force him back, threw himself from a great height to the ground, and broke his neck. Another incident, of an equally distressing nature, occurred. A young and richly dressed young man issued from a tavern in Broad Street, and with a wild and inflamed countenance, staggered along. He addressed some insulting language to Leonard, but the latter, who desired no quarrel, disregarded his remarks, and let him pass. The next person encountered by the drunken man was a young female. Suddenly catching her in his arms, he imprinted a kiss upon her lips, and then, with a frightful laugh, shouted, "I have given you the plague. Look here," and tearing aside the collar of his shirt, he exhibited a large tumor. The young woman uttered a shriek of terror and fainted, while her ruthless assailant took to his heels, and running as long as his strength lasted, fell down, and was taken to the pest house, where he was joined that same night by his victim. And this was by no means an uncommon occurrence. The distemper acted differently on different temperaments. Some it inflamed to an ungovernable pitch of madness, others it reduced to the depths of despair, while in many cases it brought out and aggravated the worst parts of the character. Wives conveyed the infection intentionally to their husbands, husbands to their wives, parents to their children, lovers to the objects of their affection, while, as in the case above mentioned, many persons ran about like rabid hounds, striving to communicate it to all they met. Greatly shocked at what had occurred, and yet not altogether surprised at it, for his mind had become familiarized with horrors, Leonard struck down Finch Lane, and proceeded towards Cornhill. On the way, he noticed 2 dead bodies lying at the mouth of a small alley, and hastening past, was stopped at the entrance to Cornhill by a butcher's apprentice, who was wheeling away the body of an old man, who had just died while purchasing meat at a stall at Stocks Market. Filled with unutterable loathing at this miserable spectacle, Leonard was fain to procure a glass of canary to recruit his spirits. Accordingly he proceeded to the Globe Tavern at the corner of Birchin Lane. As he entered the house, a lively strain of music caught his ear, and glancing in the direction of the sound, he found it proceeded from the blind piper, Mike McAskey, who was playing to some half-dozen roistering youths. Belle lay at her master's feet, and as Leonard approached the party, she pricked up her ears, and being called by name, instantly sprang towards him, and manifested the strongest delight. The piper stopped playing to listen to what was going forward, but the young man urged him to proceed, and again filled his glass. "Don't drink any more, Mike," said Leonard, "but step aside with me. I've something to say to you, something about your daughter." "My daughter," exclaimed the piper, in a half-angry, half-sorrowful voice, while a slight moisture forced itself through his orbless lids. "I don't want to hear anything about her, except that she is dead. She has deserted me, and disgraced herself." "You are mistaken," rejoined Leonard, "and if you will come with me, I will explain the truth to you." "I will listen to no explanation," rejoined the piper, furiously, "she has given me pain enough already. I'm engaged with this jovial company. Fill my glass, my master's, there, fill it again," he added, draining it eagerly, and with the evident wish to drown all thought. "There, now you shall have such a tune as was never listened to by mortal ears." A loud laugh from the young men followed this proposition, and the piper played away so furiously that it added to their merriment. Touched with compassion, Leonard walked aside, hoping, when the party broke up, to be able to have a word with the poor man. But the piper's excitement increased. He played faster and drank harder, until it was evident he was no longer in a condition to speak rationally. Leonard, therefore, addressed himself to the drawer, and desired him to look after the piper, engaging to return before midnight to see how he went on. The drawer promising compliance, Leonard departed, and not feeling disposed to continue his walk, returned to Wood Street. Nothing particular occurred during the evening. Leonard did not see Dr. Hodges, who was engaged in his professional duties, and after keeping watch before the grocer's till nearly midnight, he again retraced his steps to the Globe. The drawer was at the door, and about to close the house. "You will be sorry to learn the fate of the poor piper," he said. "Why, what has happened to him?" cried Leonard. "He is dead of the plague," was the reply. "What, so suddenly?" exclaimed the apprentice. "You are jesting with me." "Alas!" "It is no jest," rejoined the drawer, in a tone that convinced the apprentice of his sincerity. "His entertainers quitted him about 2 hours ago, and in spite of my efforts to detain him, he left the house, and sat down on those steps. Concluding he would fall asleep, I did not disturb him, and his dog kept careful watch over him. I forgot all about him till a short time ago, when hearing the pest cart pass, I went forth, and learnt that the drivers, having found him dead, as they supposed, of the pestilence, had placed their forks under his belt, and thrown him upon the other dead bodies. "And where is the dog?" cried Leonard. "She would not quit her master," replied the drawer, so the men threw her into the cart with him, saying, they would bury her in the plague pit, as all dogs were ordered to be destroyed. "This must be prevented," cried Leonard. "Which way did the dead cart go?" "Towards Moorgate," replied the drawer. Leonard heard no more, but dashing through a narrow passage opposite the conduit, past Bartholomew Lane, and traversing Lothbury, soon reached Coleman Street and the old city gate, to which he had been directed. Here he learnt that the dead cart had passed through it about 5 minutes before, and he hurried on towards Finsbury Fields. He had not proceeded far when he heard a sound as of a pipe at a distance, furiously played, and accompanied by the barking of a dog. These sounds were followed by cries of alarm, and he presently perceived 2 persons running towards him, with a swiftness which only could be occasioned by terror. One of them carried a lantern, and grasping his arm, the apprentice detained him. "What is the matter?" he asked. "The devil's the matter," replied the man. "The piper's ghost has appeared in that cart, and is playing his old tunes again." "Aye, it's either his spirit, or he has come to life again," observed the other man, stopping likewise. "I tossed him into the cart myself, and will swear he was dead enough then." "You have committed a dreadful mistake," cried Leonard. "You have tossed a living man into the cart instead of a dead one. Do you not hear those sounds?" And as he spoke, the notes of the pipe swelled to a louder strain than ever. "I tell you it is the devil or a ghost," replied the driver. "I will stay here no longer." "Lend me your lantern, and I will go to the cart," rejoined Leonard. "Take it," replied the man, "but I caution you to stay where you are. You may receive a shock you will never survive." Paying no attention to what was said, Leonard ran towards the cart, and found the piper seated upon a pile of dead bodies, most of them stripped of their covering, with Bell by his side, and playing away at a prodigious rate.